I still taste the wine. It was an expensive vintage, heavy with tannins and the metallic tang of cold ambition. But now it lingers on my tongue like a warning. It masks the terrifying reality of what I've just done. I am a fixer, a strategist paid fortunes to wield precision like a scalpel, cutting through the mess of human emotion to deliver clean, profitable results. But looking at the signed contract on the mahogany table, the ink still wet, I know I haven't just won a merger. I've exposed a hunger I spent a decade burying. The deal is closed, but the professional line? I didn't just cross it. I obliterated it. 3 hours earlier, the air in the conference room was thin enough to suffocate. We were 40 stories above the city, enclosed in a glass box that felt less like a meeting room and more like a sterile observation tank. The climate control was set to a precise 68 degrees, cold enough to keep minds sharp, or so the theory went. In reality, it just made the silence freeze in your lungs. Across the table sat Cleo. She didn't look like a CEO under siege. She looked like a statue, carved from something harder than marble. Her posture was impeccable, a straight line of defiance against the high-backed leather chair. I had spent weeks studying her portfolio, her public statements, the way she decimated competitors with a single, quiet acquisition. I thought I knew her. I thought I had the map to her vulnerabilities. But for the last 4 hours, she had dismantled every argument I presented with a terrifying, serene silence. I shifted my papers, the rustle sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. "The valuation is generous, Cleo," I said, my voice steady, though my patience was fraying. "You're holding on to a sinking asset out of sentimentality." She didn't blink. She just watched me, her eyes dark and unreadable, tracking my movements with the predatory focus of a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "Sentimentality is a liability I don't carry," she replied. Her voice was low, smooth, devoid of the panic that should have been there. "And generosity is usually a veil for theft. Try again." My standard playbook was useless here. The intimidation tactics, the logical traps, the subtle threats of a hostile takeover, they all dissolved against her indifference. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12 with a mechanical jerk. My board was expecting a call at 5. "Get it done," the chairman had growled this morning. "Whatever it takes." The pressure was a physical weight, pressing against my temples. I looked at Cleo's hands resting on the table. They were still, perfectly manicured, devoid of the nervous tics I usually exploited in these meetings. No tapping, no ringing, just stillness. The only sound in the room was the low, persistent hum of the HVAC system and the rhythmic click of my own pen cap, a nervous habit I couldn't suppress. The scent of her perfume drifted across the table, something sharp, like bergamot and wood smoke. It was distracting, cutting through the sterile smell of dry erase markers and polished wood. It smelled like control. "We are at an impasse," I said, leaning forward. "If you walk away now, the stock plummets by morning. You know the math." "I know the math," she countered, finally leaning in, mirroring my posture. The distance between us closed by inches, but the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "But you're assuming I care about the morning. I'm looking at the decade." She was immovable, a fortress. And I was running out of ammunition. The desperation clawed at my throat. I needed a win. I needed this win. My reputation, my entire career, was built on the premise that I never failed to close. But Cleo wasn't playing the game I knew. She was playing something else entirely. A game where silence was the weapon and patience was the shield. I checked the time again. 4:45 p.m. 15 minutes until the deadline I had set for myself. The lawyers were waiting in the hallway, pacing like sharks, ready to draft the final language or the press release announcing the failure. "Let's take 10, Cleo said suddenly. It wasn't a request. She signaled to her counsel, a gray-haired man who looked relieved to escape the tension. He gathered his files and left. My own team followed suit, casting worried glances in my direction. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, sealing the sound of the outer office away. Suddenly, it was just us. The room felt vast and impossibly small at the same time. The hum of the city below was a distant vibration against the glass. Cleo stood up and walked to the window, turning her back to me. Her silhouette against the gray sky was sharp, uncompromising. I watched her, the frustration warring with a grudging respect. And underneath that, a pull. A terrifying, magnetic pull toward the very thing that was destroying me. Logic had failed me. The numbers were right, the projections were flawless, and she didn't care. That meant the currency here wasn't capital. It was something else. I looked at her reflection in the darkened glass of the window, a ghost of a woman superimposed over the sprawling, indifferent city. She was waiting for me to leave, or to beg. She expected the standard desperation of a fixer who had finally hit a wall she couldn't climb. But I don't beg. I recalibrate. I stood up. I didn't check my notes. I didn't glance at the valuation summary. I left the paper fortress on the table and walked toward her. The plush carpet swallowed the sound of my heels, making my approach predatory, silent. I stopped 3 feet from her back. It was an invasion of space that no boardroom etiquette would sanction. The air between us charged instantly, the static electricity of proximity prickling against my skin. "You're not bored because the offer is low, Cleo," I said. My voice was different now, lower, stripped of the polished cadence I used for shareholders. "You're bored because you're the smartest person in every room you walk into, and you're tired of winning games that are too easy." She turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. She didn't step back to reclaim the distance. She held her ground, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that would have withered a lesser strategist. We were close enough now that I could see the gold flecks in her irises, the slight flare of her nostrils as she assessed the threat. "And you think you're the challenge I've been waiting for?" she asked. It wasn't a mockery. It was a genuine inquiry, a test. "I think you built this company as a shield," I countered, taking a half step closer. We were now operating in the red zone, that dangerous, intimate radius reserved for lovers or enemies about to strike. "You want to know if I'm just another suit with a calculator, or if I can actually see you?" The silence stretched, heavy and thick. The hum of the HVAC seemed to vanish, replaced by the thudding rhythm of my own pulse. This was the cliff edge. I could retreat to the safety of the table, apologize, and lose the deal with my dignity intact. Or I could jump. I saw her gaze flicker down to my lips, then back up, a microscopic breach in her defenses. It was all the data I needed. My hand moved before my brain signed the authorization. I reached out, my fingers brushing the silk of her blouse, resting lightly on her arm. The contact was electric, a shock that traveled straight up my spine. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, just a fraction of an inch, a silent dare. I kissed her. It wasn't romantic. It started as a collision. I wanted to shock her, to shatter the composure that had cost me 4 hours of negotiation. I pressed forward, intending to make a point, to prove that I was the one variable she hadn't modeled. But then the texture of the moment changed. Her mouth was soft, a stunning contradiction to the steel she wore like armor. I felt the precise texture of her intention shift under mine. I expected her to shove me back, to call security, to ruin me. Instead, she made a sound low in her throat, a surrender or a hunger, I couldn't tell which, and her hand came up to grip my waist. Her touch was firm, possessive. The heat of her palm burned through my blazer. The strategy disintegrated. I forgot the merger. I forgot the board. I was drowning in the terrifying realization that this wasn't a tactic anymore. I deepened the kiss, seeking something raw, and she met me there, unflinching. For 10 seconds, the world wasn't a marketplace. It was just the friction of our bodies and the taste of wine and control being lost. We broke apart only when the sound of the heavy door handle turning sliced through the air. I stepped back, my breath coming in a ragged, unmeasured rhythm. Cleo didn't look flustered. She looked illuminated. Her eyes were dark, dilated, fixed on me with a terrifying clarity. She reached up, her thumb brushing her lower lip, tracing the ghost of the impact. The heavy oak doors swung open. The lawyers filed back in, their voices a cacophony of legal chatter and shuffling papers. They didn't notice that the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally thickened. that the air was now too heavy to breathe. They didn't know that the negotiation was over, and a war of a different kind had just begun. The reality of the room reassembled itself around us, but the pieces didn't fit the same way they had 10 minutes ago. The lawyers returned in a flurry of activity, their voices a sudden, jarring intrusion of normalcy. They spoke of indemnity clauses, vesting schedules, and regulatory hurdles, the dry, dusty language of corporate law that usually grounded me. But now, their words sounded distant, like a radio playing in another room. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands clasped tightly in front of me to hide the tremor that hadn't quite subsided. My skin felt too tight, sensitized by the lingering ghost of her touch. Across the table, Cleo had returned to her seat. To the untrained eye, to the lawyers shuffling papers and checking their watches, she was exactly who she had been all afternoon, the impenetrable CEO of a rival empire. But I knew better. I saw the slight flush high on her cheekbones, a color that hadn't been there before the recess. I saw the way her gaze didn't track the documents being slid in front of her, but instead remained fixed on me, heavy and weighted with the secret we now shared. The air between us was no longer empty space. It was a taut wire, humming with the resonance of what we had just done. My lead counsel, a man who prided himself on reading the room, cleared his throat. "We've adjusted the language in Section 4 regarding the asset retention," he said, sliding the final merger agreement toward Cleo. "If you'd like to review the changes," usually this was the part where Cleo destroyed us. She was famous for finding the single misplaced comma or the ambiguous phrase that could cost a company millions. I braced myself for the dissection, for the return of the cold, analytical adversary. She didn't even look down. She reached for her pen, a heavy black fountain pen that looked like a weapon in her hand, and uncapped it with a sharp click. Her eyes never left mine. It was a look of terrifying intimacy, a silent communication that bypassed the room entirely. "I see you," that look said, "and I know exactly what you just risked." "I trust the terms are acceptable," she said, her voice smooth but with a new, smoky undertone that scraped against my nerves. It wasn't a question for her lawyer. It was a statement directed at me. "They are," I managed to reply, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. "It's a clean deal," she signed. The scratch of the nib against the paper was loud in the sudden silence, a definitive, irrevocable sound. She didn't read the final clause. She didn't check the appendices. She signed her name with a flourish of dark ink, capped the pen, and slid the document back across the vast expanse of the table. "Done," she said. The room exhaled. My team erupted into smiles and relieved murmurs, gathering the papers as if they were holy relics. Handshakes were exchanged, the ritualistic performance of corporate peace. When I took Cleo's hand, the contact was brief, professional, but the heat of her palm against mine sent a jolt straight to my chest. She squeezed my hand, once, hard, a pressure that had nothing to do with business, before pulling away. "Pleasure doing business," she murmured, and the double meaning hung in the air, invisible to everyone but me. Walking out of the building 15 minutes later felt like escaping a crash site. I moved through the marble lobby on autopilot, nodding at the security guards, my heels clicking a sharp, hollow rhythm on the floor. I needed air. I needed distance. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the city night. The evening air was crisp, carrying the bite of approaching winter and the exhaust of rush hour traffic. It should have cooled me. It should have cleared the fog of arousal and adrenaline that clouded my mind. Instead, the cold only made the heat on my skin feel more acute. I stood on the curb, waiting for my car, shivering not from the temperature, but from the aftershock. I had won. The deal of the decade was closed. My commission would be astronomical. The board would canonize me. But as I watched the city lights blur in the traffic stream, the victory felt hollow. Or perhaps it felt too full, heavy with a complication I hadn't accounted for. I had treated intimacy as a tool, a precision instrument to pry open a stubborn negotiation. I had told myself it was strategy. But as the black town car pulled up and I slid into the leather back seat, the truth settled in the pit of my stomach, heavy and undeniable. It hadn't been a strategy. It had been a confession. I hadn't kissed her to close a deal. I had kissed her because for the first time in 10 years, I had met someone who looked at the abyss of ambition and didn't blink. The ride home was a blur of neon and shadows. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the silence that greeted me wasn't the sanctuary it usually was. The expansive, minimalist living room, with its view of the skyline and its perfectly curated furniture, felt stark, abrasive. I tossed my keys on the counter, the sound echoing too loudly. I poured a drink, amber liquid into crystal, and stood by the window, looking out at the same city I had just conquered. But the thrill of the kill was gone. In its place was a gnawing, restless hunger. I touched my lips, remembering the texture of hers, the shocking softness, the taste of wine and surrender. I was alone in my tower, the victor of the day, but the solitude felt less like a prize and more like a sentence. I had opened a door I couldn't close, and now the silence was deafening. 3 days of radio silence. In my line of work, silence usually means the opposition is scrambling. But this felt different. It felt like a held breath. I checked my phone. Not obsessively, I told myself, just with professional diligence. But the screen remained blank. The deal was closed, the merger announced, and the stock had jumped 4 points. By all metrics, it was a triumph. But the silence told a different story. I tried to pivot. I had other clients, other fires to put out. A tech merger in San Francisco was bleeding money. A pharmaceutical CEO needed a crisis management strategy for a leaked email. Standard, high-stakes chaos. Usually, I thrive in this. I dissect the problem, isolate the variables, and execute the solution with surgical detachment. But my mind was a fractured lens. I sat in a high-level strategy meeting, staring at a whiteboard covered in flowcharts, and the lines blurred. I missed a crucial clause in a draft contract, a rookie mistake that my junior associate had to catch. "You look tired," she'd said, tentatively, sliding a coffee across the table. I wasn't tired. I was haunted. The precision I prided myself on, the cold, analytical edge that made me dangerous, had been blunted by the memory of soft lips and the smell of bergamot. The fear wasn't about the deal. The papers were filed, the ink was dry. The fear was far more personal, and therefore far more terrifying. Had I misread the data? I am a student of human behavior. I read micro-expressions like ticker tape. I knew what I felt in that boardroom. I felt the surrender in her posture, the answering heat in her touch. But doubt is a corrosive acid. Maybe I was just another conquest. Maybe Cleo saw my calculated risk for exactly what it was, a moment of weakness, and exploited it to get the signature she wanted. I was in the break room when David, a senior partner, poured coffee and chuckled darkly. "Heard you close the Thornton deal. Miracle worker." He took a sip, leaning against the counter. "Watch your back, though. Cleo doesn't lose. If she gave you a win, she's planning to take something much bigger in return. She eats strategists for breakfast. I've seen her dismantle careers just for sport." His words settled in my stomach like lead. She eats strategists. Was I just a meal? Or was I the exception? I went back to my office and closed the door. I didn't work. I replayed the tape. I treated the memory of the kiss like a black box recording from a crash site. I analyzed the pressure of her hand on my waist. Was it possessive or restraining? I recalled the sound she made. Was it desire or triumph? I could still feel the phantom sensation of her breath against my cheek, the way the air in the room had thickened. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a collision of two stars. But feelings are not facts, and without facts, I was flying blind, spiraling into a vertigo I hadn't felt since I was an intern. Then the pattern broke. It didn't come via email or text. It arrived via a courier in a nondescript uniform. He handed me a heavy, cream-colored envelope, the kind that costs more than most people's rent. My name was handwritten on the front in black ink, sharp, angular letters. No return address. But I knew that handwriting. I had watched her sign a billion-dollar merger with the same stroke. My hands shook slightly, a tremor of anticipation and dread, as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a single card, thick and textured. An invitation. Not to a meeting, to a gala. tonight. The venue was a cavern of stone and glass, a museum atrium converted into a playground for the city's untouchables. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies, expensive catering, and the specific, heavy perfume of old money. A string quartet played something classical and unobtrusive in the corner, but the music was drowned out by the low, continuous murmur of 300 people who controlled the GDP of a small nation. The lighting was low, amber and gold, designed to flatter aging skin and make diamonds catch fire. It was a beautiful, suffocating cage. I checked my coat and smoothed the silk of my dress. I had chosen black, severe, backless, a weapon disguised as evening wear. It was my armor. Tonight, I wasn't the woman who had unraveled in a conference room. I was the strategist, the fixer, the entity that existed to solve problems. I took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, not to drink, but to have something to hold, a barrier between me and the rest of the room. I moved into the crowd, my eyes scanning the room with the mechanical precision of a radar sweep. I saw the usual suspects: the senator who needed a scandal buried last year, the tech mogul whose IPO I had salvaged. They nodded, smiled, raised glasses. I returned the gestures with practiced ease, but my focus didn't waver. I was looking for the threat. I was looking for the reason I was here. And then the room seemed to tilt. She was standing near a marble column, holding court with a circle of banking executives. If I had thought Cleo was formidable in a boardroom, I was unprepared for the reality of her in this light. She wore a gown of deep, midnight blue velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, cutting a silhouette of absolute darkness against the pale stone. The severe bun was gone. Her hair was loose, a dark curtain that softened the sharp angles of her jaw. But the posture was the same, that terrifying, effortless stillness that made everyone around her look frantic by comparison. She wasn't looking at the man speaking to her. She was looking at the entrance. She was looking at me. The distance across the room was perhaps 50 feet, but the pull was instantaneous and violent. It was a physical force, a hook in my chest, reeling me in. The noise of the party, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the gossip, faded into a dull roar of static. There was only the line of sight between us, charged and heavy. I saw her excuse herself from the group, her movement fluid, like water flowing around a stone. She didn't walk toward me. She moved toward the bar, a tangential path that invited pursuit without demanding it. I followed. I navigated the sea of tuxedos and silk, dodging conversations that would have trapped me for 20 minutes on any other night. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with a slow, heavy thud that I felt in my throat. I reached the bar just as she turned, a fresh drink in her hand. "You came," she said. Her voice was pitched low, running under the noise of the crowd like a current. She didn't smile. Her eyes were dark, assessing, stripping away the armor I had spent an hour constructing. "I received a summons," I replied, setting my untouched champagne on the marble counter. I kept my voice even, matching her tone. I assumed attendance was mandatory for the merger to hold. "The merger is ironclad," Cleo said, taking a step closer. The warmth of her presence hit me again, visceral and familiar, triggering a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the room temperature. "This isn't business, or rather, it's a different kind of negotiation." "I didn't think you believed in negotiating after the contract was signed," I countered. The subtext was screaming between us, loud enough to shatter glass. We were talking about paperwork, but we were discussing the kiss. We were discussing the silence. "I believe in clarifying terms," she said. She held out her glass, offering it to me. "Try this. The champagne is pedestrian. This is better." It was a test. Everything with her was a test. I reached out to take the glass. My fingers brushed hers against the cold crystal. The contact was brief, a fraction of a second, but the shock was electric. It wasn't the static of a carpet. It was the live wire of recognition. Her fingers were warm, contrasting with the ice in the glass. And for a moment, neither of us let go. We stood there, locked in a tableau of polite society, two women sharing a drink, while the air around us thickened to the point of suffocation. She released the glass and I took a sip. It was whiskey, neat, smoky, complex, burning on the way down. It tasted like her. It's strong, I said, meeting her gaze over the rim. I prefer things that don't dilute over time, she replied, her eyes dropping to my mouth, then snapping back up with a renewed intensity. She glanced around the crowded room, her expression tightening with disdain for the noise, the performance, the lack of privacy. It's too loud in here, she murmured, leaning in so her breath ghosted against my ear. The proximity made my knees weak. I can't hear what you're not saying. Let's find somewhere to discuss the implementation details. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked toward a set of glass doors, partially obscured by a heavy velvet curtain, knowing, with arrogant certainty, that I would follow. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind us, severing the noise of the gala as cleanly as a guillotine blade. The sudden silence was jarring. The air out here was raw, stripped of the expensive perfume and the cloying warmth of the ballroom. It smelled of ozone, exhaust, and the impending rain that hung heavy over the skyline. We were 40 stories up, standing on a terrace of limestone and shadow, with the entire city spread out below us like a grid of electric circuitry. Cleo walked to the edge, her heels silent on the stone. She didn't look at me. She placed her hands on the cold railing and looked out at the abyss of light and concrete. The wind whipped strands of dark hair across her face, but she didn't move to brush them away. She looked like a figurehead on the prow of a ship sailing into a storm, stoic, solitary, and terrifyingly beautiful. I stayed back, leaning against the rough stone of the building, watching her. My skin was still humming from the brief contact at the bar, a phantom heat that the cold wind couldn't dissipate. I need to know, she said. She didn't turn around. Her voice was snatched by the wind, but the clarity of her tone cut through the distance. It wasn't a demand. It was a prerequisite. In that room, when you crossed the line, was it just a tactic? The question hung between us, heavier than the humidity. It was the trap I had been fearing for 3 days. As a strategist, I knew the safe answer. I knew the answer that protected the merger, my commission, and my professional reputation. I should tell her it was whatever she wanted it to be. I should spin the narrative, frame the moment as a mutual agreement of power dynamics, keep the walls up. Admitting it was a tactic would make me cruel, a mercenary who used intimacy as leverage. But claiming it was real, that made me unprofessional. That made me vulnerable. And in my world, vulnerability is usually fatal. I looked at the back of her neck, exposed by the wind. I remembered the softness of her surrender in the boardroom, the way the steel had melted under my touch. The truth was a weapon I was about to hand her, hilt first. The timing was a calculation, I said, stepping away from the wall. I walked toward her, the sound of my dress rustling against the stone, the only noise in the vast quiet. I knew I had to break the stalemate. I knew logic wasn't working. I stopped beside her, gripping the railing. The metal was freezing against my palms, grounding me. I didn't look at her. I looked out at the city, mirroring her stance. But the impulse? That wasn't strategy. That was a liability I couldn't afford. I didn't kiss you to close the deal, Cleo. I kissed you because for the first time in 10 years, I wanted to lose control. The confession felt like a physical weight leaving my chest. I waited for the recoil. I waited for her to laugh, to dismantle me, to tell me I was compromised. Instead, she let out a breath that ghosted white in the cold air. She turned her head, her dark eyes searching my profile with a frightening intensity. "Good," she murmured. "Good?" I turned to face her, the confusion genuine. "I had the press release drafted," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my bones. The one announcing the collapse of the merger. It was in my drafts folder. I was going to walk away at 5 p.m. I was bored, and I was going to kill the deal just to feel something real. She took a step closer, closing the distance until the heat of her body acted as a shield against the wind. "You didn't just win the negotiation, you saved it. That moment of precision, it was the only honest thing that happened in that room." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The stakes hadn't just been high, they had been absolute. We had both been standing on the edge of the precipice, waiting for the other to jump. The tension that had been building since the boardroom didn't break, it evolved. It shifted from the sharp, anxious energy of uncertainty to a deep, heavy pull of anticipation. "So," I whispered, the word barely audible. We're not discussing the merger. The merger is done, Cleo said. She reached out, her fingers brushing the bare skin of my arm, a touch that was searing in the cold air. It wasn't a question this time. It was an invitation to the only negotiation that mattered now. I'm done with the gala. I'm done with the noise. My car is downstairs. She didn't wait for my answer. She didn't need to. The unsaid agreement hung heavy between us, absolute and terrifying. We walked back toward the glass doors, leaving the cold wind and the city lights behind, moving toward a private merger that would require a different kind of surrender entirely. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, revealing a space that felt less like a home and more like a high-altitude observation deck. Cleo's penthouse was a study in severe elegance. Acres of polished concrete, walls of floor-to-ceiling glass, and furniture that looked beautiful but punished anyone who tried to get comfortable. It was silent, vast, and terrifyingly empty. There were no personal photos, no clutter, no evidence that a human being lived here rather than just operated here. It was a fortress of solitude built on the 55th floor, a physical manifestation of the woman standing beside me. Cleo kicked off her heels the moment we crossed the threshold. The sound of the shoes hitting the floor was the first crack in the armor. She walked to the window, not to look out this time, but to close the sheer blinds, softening the glare of the city she ruled. When she turned back to me, the CEO was gone. Her shoulders had dropped an inch. The guarded, predatory sharpness in her eyes had softened into something weary and undeniably human. "You live like a ghost," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. I walked further in, trailing my hand along the back of a slate gray sofa. "Everything here is designed to keep people out." "Everything here is designed to keep me focused," she corrected, though the defense lacked her usual heat. She walked to a small bar cart, vintage, brass, the only warm object in the room, and poured 2 glasses of water. No more alcohol. We were drunk enough on the proximity. Intimacy is a distraction. You know that. It's a variable you can't control in a spreadsheet. "Is that why we do it?" I asked, taking the glass she offered. Our fingers brushed again, but this time, neither of us pulled away. "Because we're afraid of the variables?" "We do it because we're good at it," she whispered, stepping into my space. The distance between us was gone now. "We do it because winning feels safer than feeling." The truth of it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. We were 2 architects of our own isolation, successful women who had traded warmth for precision, now standing in the wreckage of our own defenses. The professional masks didn't just drop, they shattered. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. She wasn't an opponent. She was a mirror. I set the glass down on a side table with a deliberate click. "I don't want to win tonight," I admitted. The vulnerability was terrifying, a raw nerve exposed to the air. "Neither do I," Cleo replied. The second kiss was nothing like the first. The boardroom had been about shock and dominance, a clash of wills. This was slow. It was a deliberate, agonizing study of texture and warmth. She reached out, her hands cupping my face with a reverence that made my breath hitch. Her thumbs traced the line of my jaw, mapping the bone structure as if she were memorizing it. When her lips met mine, it wasn't a demand. It was a question, asked in the language of breath and pressure. I answered by stepping closer, eliminating the last fraction of space between our bodies. The sensation was overwhelming. The heat of her skin through the silk of her dress, the solid, grounding weight of her embrace. It was a sensory overload of heat and skin and the terrifying relief of finally putting down the weapon. I felt her sigh against my mouth, a sound of pure surrender that vibrated through my chest. We moved blindly toward the sofa, a tangle of limbs and intentions. There was no rush, no frantic grappling. We had spent our careers racing against clocks. Tonight, we suspended time. I ran my hands down the curve of her spine, feeling the tension uncoil muscle by muscle. She pulled me down with her, her grip possessive, anchoring me in the storm. In the quiet of that penthouse, stripped of titles and strategies, we weren't rivals. We were equals. There was no one winning, no one losing, just the profound, heavy realization that I had been lonely for a very long time, And suddenly, I wasn't. But the world doesn't stop for revelations. Morning arrived, not with a gentle fade-in, but with the harsh, blinding clarity of winter light cutting through the blinds. I woke to the smell of coffee and the ominous, buzzing vibration of a phone on the glass coffee table. The sanctuary had been breached. The sun was up, the market was opening, and the silence was about to be broken by a threat we hadn't strategized for. The phone on the glass coffee table wasn't just buzzing. It was vibrating with the frantic, staccato rhythm of a priority alert. The sound shattered the morning silence like a brick through a window. I watched the screen light up. Urgent, market shift, hostile action, and felt the warm, suspended reality of the penthouse evaporate. The sun that had felt inviting a moment ago now glared with an accusatory brightness, exposing the scattered clothes and the vulnerability of the night before. I sat up, the sheet pooling at my waist, my heart hammering a warning against my ribs. This is the part where it breaks, I thought. This is the morning after, where the logic returns, the suspicion creeps in, and the walls slam back into place. Cleo was already moving. She swept into the room, phone pressed to her ear, her voice a low, lethal murmur that I had heard a dozen times across a negotiation table. "Block the trade," she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Freeze the liquidity pool. I don't care what the bylaws say." She ended the call and looked at me. I froze, bracing myself for the accusation. The merger was less than 24 hours old. A leak, a countermove, a regulatory ambush, any of it could look like a setup. She would assume I was the Trojan horse, that the kiss was the distraction, and this was the knife. I prepared my defense. I prepared to be asked to leave. Instead, she tossed a tablet onto the bed next to me. "Vanguard Capital," she said, her eyes dark, not with anger, but with focus. "They're leveraging the debt structure to force a breakup before the market closes. They think we're distracted. They think we're soft." She grabbed a fresh shirt from the closet, buttoning it with efficient, angry movements. "I need your mind on this. Get dressed." The relief was so sharp it was dizzying, followed immediately by a surge of adrenaline that rivaled the night before. She didn't want me to leave. She wanted me to fight. We turned the stark, minimalist dining table into a war room. For the next 6 hours, the world outside the floor-to-ceiling windows ceased to exist. We didn't touch. We didn't speak of the balcony or the bedroom. And yet, the intimacy was suffocating. I had spent my career studying her defenses, looking for cracks in the armor. Fighting with her, from the inside of the fortress, was a revelation. It was like watching a master musician finally find the only other person who knew the score. I handled the media narrative, spinning the hostile bid as a desperate, flailing grasp by a failing competitor. I worked the phones, leaking strategic doubts to the financial press, poisoning the well for Vanguard before they could even secure their financing. Across the table, Cleo handled the board. I watched her dismantle a panicked director on speakerphone with 3 sentences, her voice never rising above a conversational volume. It was brutal. It was surgical. And God, it was arousing. There is a specific, dangerous kind of heat in shared competence. Watching her mind work, the way she anticipated the enemy's move 3 steps in advance, the ruthless efficiency with which she cut off their funding avenues, was just as visceral as her hands on my skin. We moved in perfect sync, a 2-headed monster of corporate warfare. When I needed a projection figure, she slid the paper across the table before I asked. When she needed a legal precedent to stall the filing, I was already reciting the case law. We weren't just partners. We were a single organism, breathing the same air, thinking the same thoughts. The friction that had made us rivals was now fueling an engine that nothing could stop. By 2 p.m., the news broke. Vanguard withdrew the bid. The stock stabilized. The threat evaporated, dissolved by the sheer force of our combined will. We sat back in the chairs, surrounded by the debris of battle. Empty coffee cups, printed spreadsheets, tablets running hot. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of the morning. It was the ringing, electric silence of a battlefield after the smoke clears. We were exhausted, running on caffeine and pure adrenaline, but we were victorious. Cleo looked across the table at me. Her hair was coming loose, a smudge of ink stained her thumb, and she looked more beautiful than she had in the gala gown. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. We had just proven the dangerous hypothesis that had started in the boardroom. We were formidable alone, but together, we were unstoppable. The external threat hadn't driven us apart. It had welded us together. The sun began to dip below the western horizon, painting the skyline in bruised purples and burnt oranges, colors that felt appropriate for the aftermath of a war. We hadn't moved from the table for an hour, simply breathing in the silence that followed the chaos. The screens were finally dark. The threat from Vanguard was neutralized, their hostile bid retracted and buried under a mountain of strategic leaks and legal roadblocks. But the energy in the room hadn't dissipated. It had transmuted into something deeper, heavier. I watched Cleo. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass, staring out at the city, the very empire we had just defended. Her posture was different now. The tension that usually held her spine in a rigid line of command was gone. In its place was a fluid, easy grace. She looked settled. I stood up, my muscles protesting the hours of stillness, and walked to join her at the glass. The reflection showed two women standing side by side, not as adversaries, but as architects. "So," Cleo said, her voice breaking the quiet without shattering it. She didn't turn to face me. She watched the first streetlights flicker on below, a grid of stars waking up to replace the sun. Vanguard is gone, the merger is ratified, the board is pacified. She turned then, her dark eyes catching the last of the fading light, holding a warmth that she never showed the public. "What is the next move, strategist?" It was the question I lived for. Usually, I would have a roadmap ready, a 3-point plan for integration, a PR blitz, a restructuring of the executive suite. But the playbook was empty. Or rather, the playbook was obsolete. The old strategies didn't apply to this terrain. "The business is handled," I answered, stepping into her space, grounding myself in the present. "But the partnership? We're just drafting the opening clause." She smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached her eyes, and reached out to straighten the collar of my shirt. Her knuckles brushed the pulse point of my neck, a deliberate, lingering touch that felt like a seal of approval. It was a gesture of ownership, not of me, but of us, of the entity we had created in the fire of the last 24 hours. "It's a high-risk portfolio," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw, her gaze dropping to my lips. "Mixing this kind of leverage with this kind of distraction. The market doesn't like volatility." "The volatility is high," I agreed, leaning into her touch, feeling the solid, unflinching reality of her presence. "But the returns are infinite." We were gambling everything. Our reputations, our control, the carefully constructed safety of our solitary lives. But standing there, with the city at our feet and the heat of her hand on my skin, I knew the valuation was correct. "Then let's go," she said softly, her hand sliding down to grip mine, her fingers interlacing with a strength that promised she wouldn't let go. "The car is waiting." We walked out into the cool night air, shoulder to shoulder. The heavy thud of the car door closing behind us didn't sound like a cage this time. It sounded like a vault, sealing us in our own private world. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, I realized that some deals change your portfolio, but the rare ones rewrite your entire existence. If you've ever taken a risk that changed everything, tell me in the comments. I felt Cleo's hand find mine in the dark, holding tight.